Hello there, my favorite randos on the internet. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Let's Disagree and Other Interesting Conversations with Colby Reddish. I'm your host today, and I am joined by a friend of mine. We've actually met in person once, Ganesh. I don't know if you remember that at Sunstone probably 2 years ago, but I
Yes,
was a
yes.
rando at that time. So,
Well, you're certainly not a rando now. You are
no.
you're very well versed across the multi-Mormon universe, and it's lovely to see that you have a lot of reach. I guess just because you speak so eloquently, but also very thoughtful, logical, empathetic. I think you bring a lot to the table, which is it's so lovely.
Well, that's so kind of you. Thank you for being here today. For those who aren't aware, my guest today is Ganesh Cherian. He is a very prolific podcaster in the post-Mormon space. He's an author of a biography of Joseph Smith. I know I have a copy of it, but I can't remember the title off the top of my head. Ganesh.
It is, let's see if I can put it on there. Joseph Smith, the Architect of Mormonism. It's a biography. It's a topical biography.
Perfect. And today we are going to kind of start by talking about some background and context on why you wrote that topical guide to Mormonism through the lens of Joseph Smith's life. I think it's one of the more interesting biographies of Joseph Smith I've read. I'll admit to you, I haven't read the entirety of it, but I have used it as a topical reference, which I think is kind of probably one of the reasons you wrote it the way that you did, looking at different topics. Is that right?
That's right, and I'm glad that you're using it like that, because I think that's its real power, is to be able to go, hang on a second, do I understand this topic in the church, particularly the early church, and with Joseph Smith, and and just go and have a look and go, oh gosh, these are the parts. Maybe there are some things that you discover, and I'm always open to that, because it's impossible to get everything on paper, but I wanted it to be used as a bit of a resource. And so I'm glad that people are using it like that.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Well, our bigger conversation today, after we kind of introduce some background and context on Ganesh's book, and I want to ask him a few questions about his approach to, studying Joseph Smith and kind of compiling the biography that he did, is we're going to talk about Book of Mormon authorship, because I think one of the things that you and I have looked at together, Ganesh, obviously not together before, together today, but have looked at separately, is just questions around Book of Mormon authorship. There's a lot of interest in Book of Mormon authorship right now. You just did an episode with Rebecca Biblioteca on Mormonish, talking about sole authorship theories. They have been hosting Patrick, I can't remember his last name.
Yes. I probably look it up, Barchi or something like that. Yep.
Yeah. Patrick is a Spalding-Rigdon manuscript theorist. Different theory from Lars Nielsen's book from a few years ago, but similar core, I guess I would say, and then it's a Spalding-Rigdon manuscript theory. I know Dr. John Lundwall has been looking at Book of Mormon authorship through the lens of kind of his expertise. So I feel like there's a lot of different people interested in Book of Mormon authorship right now. I feel like I am least among them, but I definitely am very interested in it. So I'm feeling like our conversation will really talk today about why Book of Mormon authorship still matters, even for those of us on the post-Mormon side of the equation. And I feel like it's not just an abstract historical question, right? It really goes to, like you said, help inform the evolution of this church, the way the church has changed since its earlier days, and can really be an insight into understanding Joseph Smith and his motivation as well as his life. And I feel like that's one of the things I've really picked out of our conversations kind of behind the scenes setting this episode up, is the approach you have to understanding what was going on in Joseph Smith's life, then comparing that to the revelations or scriptures that he's producing at the same time period, I think has given you a lot of insights into Joseph Smith. Any other framing from your perspective for today's episode?
Well, I guess, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Book of Mormon authorship is a really big deal, and has been forever, I think, because the church lays its foundation at the Book of Mormon. Really, there isn't a church before the Book of Mormon. We even talk about the first meeting being April 6th, 1830, on the back of the Book of Mormon publication. And so those two things are incredibly tied together and very difficult to separate. So it is massive. And that's one of the reasons I got into writing the book in the first place. I had been interested in my kind of post-Mormon understandings that things were a little different in terms of, particularly from the Gospel Topics essays, that the ways that the church had represented its history may not have been wholly accurate or complete. And so one of the things that kind of gave me an impetus to start writing was that I happened to be COVID, and Sunstone didn't meet in person, so they released a lot of their episodes online. And one of those episodes was with William Davis, talking about his groundbreaking work, Visions in a Seer Stone. And that made me really look at the Book of Mormon as a type of performance. And then the second thing that happened soon after that, for me at least, was that Dan McClellan, who was a biblical, scripture translation supervisor for the church, started to do TikToks. And one of the things that he didn't talk about his membership in the church very much, but when he talked about the Book of Mormon, he said that it was a 19th century text, and the best way to understand it was through a 19th century lens. And so I'd written a few articles before, and I thought, I'd noticed some things about the Book of Mormon and how it had related to Joseph later in his life, and some contradictions there, particularly between the text of the Book of Mormon and the more singular, unique doctrines that we see come out of Nauvoo. And I wanted to draw a bit of a contrast. And so, armed with the information from William Davis and kind of permission, I think, from Dan McClellan at the time, I sat down to write some thoughts about things that I noticed that were different from the Book of Mormon and then our unique doctrines in the church. And so as I started to write that, I started to find a bit of a pattern. And the pattern was that the Book of Mormon had a particular way of viewing the world, and what the church had become by Nauvoo was a different way of viewing the world. And a lot of them were contradictions. And, the classic one, of course, is polygamy. But there were a number of others. And I started to see that there was this massive contrast between what the Book of Mormon kind of taught and what was being practiced in Nauvoo. And so I just kept finding them, kept finding these little parallels. And then I realized, well, I could, if I had a question, then I could look at its Book of Mormon roots or its Nauvoo expression, and I could kind of, contrast those two and get an idea of what had gone on. And then I found that there were little points in between of how they went from one to the other. And it just, what I thought was going to be a little article became example after example after example after example. And the singular thing that tied those two things together was Joseph himself. His development, his worldview, his environment, the people around him, and what he was trying to accomplish. And so that then it automatically became a biography. But because I was looking at it per interest or topic, it became a topical biography. So I could kind of, once I started, when I had those 2 points, the Book of Mormon text and Nauvoo practice, I could then look at what was happening in the environment around Joseph prior to the Book of Mormon, what was happening in his family on those particular issues, what was happening to him personally, and then correlate that with what was happening in the text of the Book of Mormon. And then, of course, the early church, many ways, was trying to implement those same things. So the early church was in line with those things. And then there was some kind of pivot, some place where the teachings or the ideas or the philosophy of the Book of Mormon smacked up against real life. And Joseph had to explain that or, work with that, or whatever he had to do, and that caused a pivot. And he changed, and the people around him changed to accommodate the realities that the teachings were butting up against, and that changed the direction and pivoted to another understanding, and that other understanding often became the unique practice of the church by Nauvoo. And so, and then of course, for the Utah expression, that then morphed into, what Brigham Young ran with and made a theocracy in Utah. So,
sure.
So that's just a trajectory that seemed to hold true regardless of the topic, and it's the same trajectory. It just happened to be in different places. The pivot sometimes was in 1830, sometimes in 1835, sometimes it was 1840, sometimes it was 1842. But all of these little changes, or sometimes little, that combined to be such a big change, or sometimes it was a really definitive one moment where things pivoted. These things explained why it was different in Nauvoo, and so what this is a big roundabout way of saying is that Book of Mormon authorship, really got me to write a biography, because the only way I could explain the things that were going on in the church and was by Joseph's own personal experience and events, and how they were working in real time for him and others in the church. So that's where we got to. So
that's really interesting to me. So let me ask you, as you were writing your book, how did you deal with trying to balance Joseph Smith's different roles, right? He plays this role as a founding prophet of this burgeoning movement that has all these different splits along multiple different parts of its history, even while he's alive, let alone after he's been assassinated. How did you balance, like, Joseph Smith as a religious founder, a sincere seeker of truth, a literary and creative figure, and a product of his environment? How did you keep track of all these different roles that, whether we see him that way or not, people in Joseph Smith's milieu and world very much saw him in these different ways, right? Some people saw him as a scoundrel. Some people saw him as a dutiful son. Some people saw him in these completely different roles. How did you balance that while writing a biography of someone who really was, to borrow the phrase from Moroni, spoken of good or evil by so many different people?
Well, I don't know that it was intentional, but what actually happened, because I was viewing everything by topic, I let the topic speak. I guess you could say it's a biography of topics. The topic, I tracked the topic through the life of Joseph, and just saw where he was at, depending on that topic at any particular time. And we had some quite good measures to that. It may have been, text in the Book of Mormon. It may have been a revelation at a particular, date. It could have been a journal entry. It could have been a court document. It could have been a letter, and then it could have been a newspaper publication. So the topic kept, for me, it kept me on track, so that when I didn't try to explain Joseph in his different roles as much as I explained the topic and how it was presenting in his life at a particular point. And that seemed to tie it all together quite well, like in a really in a coherent way that made sense to me, but also helped me to view a particular idea and track it, and see that Joseph's expression of that topic was really key to what was going on.
Yeah, so it helped you understand kind of these different roles of Joseph through the lens of the topics. It probably also, I'm imagining, because I like studying things by topic myself too. I feel like when we study things sometimes chronologically, it can lead us into traps of certain logical fallacies, especially when we're dealing with historical subject matter. One that comes up all the time is like the idea of presentism, right? Or the idealist fallacy, when we're going to assume that someone will have had the same position throughout the entirety of their life because it's so distant to us. That's something that we see a lot. And I'm imagining that your approach to working through these materials in Smith's life probably actually helped guard against a lot of those very common ways of falling into the trap of fallacious thinking because you were looking at each topic kind of discreetly. Obviously, it's one larger work, but each different topic is treated as, like you said, more of a topical biography with these check-ins throughout Joseph's life on the same topic.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the, when you've got a theory and you're testing your theory, one of the things that helps you to feel like you're on the right track and not just, delving into your own bias, is that you find, solid pieces that fit in the trajectory in the right places, so that it gives you a measure of reliability that's what's happening. So I'm always really conscious that, my bias gives me huge amounts of understanding in a particular area, but it also blinds me to other things. It's just being
Right.
human, right? So, I'm always trying to think of, well, how can I test this? What are the things that are consistent? What is there anything that's inconsistent? Is there any information that is saying this is wrong, or the feeling is different? And for the vast majority of the topics that I looked at, the arc was really consistent in a very fundamental way. And the fundamental way was that the Book of Mormon, seemed to express a 23-year-old Joseph, and Nauvoo seemed to express a 38-year-old Joseph. That's the two things. However, that there were a few topics that that weren't quite a simple arc. That they equivocated. He would go in and out of various understandings, or he'd seem to pivot one way and then pivot another way. And then I had to think, okay, well, does this fit the model? What's going on here? Can I understand what's happening? And try and see whether the model was broken, or he's not acting like this particular model for a fundamental reason. A good example of this would be slavery. Like there are definitely some kind of anti-slavery passages in the Book of Mormon, and then there's some early anti-slavery material written in Missouri, and then of course there's a huge backlash for the Missouri Saints because of that, because Missouri's a slave state, and of course American history, this is a battleground. Entering the Union meant, it was such a slavery was such a contentious issue that they were providing states into the Union one for one, slave-owned, slave states, non-slave states, and Missouri was a slave state. And of course, these mostly northerner converts of the church were entering this southern understanding of slavery, and that was butting up against each other. And so, and then this political environment was causing a conflict. Joseph kind of equivocates in 1836, but in Nauvoo he does some things kind of pro-slavery, or racist and very separatist kind of ways, but also some very embracing ways. And so there's and then of course he runs for president and he has a platform. So understanding who and why and what, so the slave question is not quite so
It's not a clean singular
It's not a
arc,
clean.
basically.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Well, and I
But
think that's one of the things that's most interesting to me about Joseph Smith is that there are examples I could give you, like his famous infants on thrones quote, right, from one of his later sermons near the end of his life, where I think a lot of times Joseph Smith, and I don't mean to impute any intention beyond just what I'm saying here. I think a lot of times Joseph Smith, we see very clear, and this is one of the things I really like about your biography, is we see very clear situations where Joseph Smith is almost like a pragmatist. And maybe he was a sincere believer also, but there was definitely an element in him of wanting to tell people the things that they wanted to hear, right? I think about the persecution that the saints had been through before he makes this statement, because really theologically, cosmologically, it's a ridiculous notion that we've got these infants sitting on thrones, right? But if you think about it in the context of what he's trying to do, that he's building a community and he's trying to connect with these grieving mothers who have lost these children, and that he is trying to connect with this spirituality and these grand promises, this, I don't know, there is something about Joseph Smith's theology, especially as it evolved, that I sympathize with his desire to have this like grander connection to all humanity. Of course, I don't necessarily believe that it's true theology, right? But I can appreciate, I think, sometimes his ability to try and, I don't even want to say tell people what they want to hear, because that sounds manipulative. And I think he definitely was at certain times, but I think at other times, it really is him trying to fill a need. I know that Dan Vogel views the Book of Mormon even partially that way, that it's filling his family system needs, right? When we're dealing with Alvin's death, and we're dealing with the division in his direct family, his immediate family, regarding religious division and questions of universalism versus, not so universalism. As you worked on Joseph Smith's biography, what is maybe one element where your opinion of Joseph Smith changed the most?
Oh, okay, that's a really, really good question. Gosh, I think the thing that I there's a few chapters in my book that I feel really surprising. They were surprising to me, things that I hadn't really thought of very much prior. And maybe, again, this is because of my bias. I live in New Zealand. I'm outside the United States. My wife's American. My children are American. And so, like, really understanding how patriotic Joseph was is, really surprised me. It's laden in the Book of Mormon, this American exceptionalism, but also a real devotion to a republic, and the ways in which you can determine your own fate, which are really salient early 19th century American ideas, especially as you have the Revolutionary War. And of course, oh gosh, it's July 4th, 250 years. So, and also it's the second Revolutionary War, which was 1812, where this resolve for a republic was tested. Those things are really embedded in early 19th century America, and really embedded in Joseph's family. Both his grandfathers were veterans of the Revolutionary War. His mother's father was also in the French Indian Wars prior. None of his family served in the 1812 war, but it was near his house when he was a boy, kind of lame from his leg surgery. So these are things that are filling the paper. These are the things he's really interested in, this idea of American exceptionalism and American determination of freedom. And so that is embedded in the Book of Mormon in some really incredible ways. And I have a whole section on this, because there are just so many different facets of this separation of church and state, patriotism, even patriarchy is part of that. And then, of course, the church is formed. We see those same kinds of things in the early Doctrine and Covenants, with the Constitution being inspired. And then we see this kind of break where, at first there's an intention to adhere to state and federal law, and a real appeal when things go wrong. And then by 1838 in Missouri, there's a real break. The idea that he's not going to submit his will to the state or to the federal government, and the federal government, basically disappoints him. There's no redress for the eviction out of Missouri, and even though Illinois people give him basically a clean slate with a city charter and ability to determine his own future, he doesn't take that and make it a thing that's a beauty for the rest of the environment. He takes that and makes that effectively a separate city state, and then fights against the surrounding area, and then eventually the United States as a whole. And he really has some grandiose ideas by the end of his life that he is going, that America is rotten, that they're going to leave it, and they're going to establish their own theocracy. Effectively, the Council of 50 is a shadow cabinet where he's going to effect his new government. He's actually committing treason, and so this is such an interesting and completely contradictory thing, because of course in the Book of Mormon, those people who are trying to set up a city state, who are trying to become kings of their own right, these are king men, these are traitors, these, according to Captain Moroni, deserve death and will, and yet he is actually doing that in Nauvoo in 1844. And we never talk about this, but he brings the state of Illinois to the brink of civil war. And he's already done that in Missouri, 6 years earlier. So the idea that in his lifetime, he's effectively undermining states' rights, and he is putting himself above others. He's doing exactly the kinds of things that the Book of Mormon warns against and speaks against, and he's doing it. It's fascinating, and of course the church never tells that part of the story because it's treasonous, but also a complete contradiction. But when you document that in his life and the ways he's dealing with Governor Ford in 1844, it's amazing and beautiful, but also harrowing. If Joseph had his way, he was definitely an authoritarian leader. He was going to usurp his authority over other people, and that was definitely the neighboring towns felt like that was a threat. They believed that he was going to, overturn democracy in America in 1844, which is slightly crazy when we think about where we're at now in 2026. But that's we could talk about that quite a bit in other kind of political ways. But that's one of the most fascinating things.
Yeah, definitely. Let me ask you a question that I've always wondered about. I've asked my non-American Mormon friends this question for years, because one of the things that's confusing to me about the appeal of the Book of Mormon outside of the United States is that it has American exceptionalism basically baked into the doctrine, right? Even the appearance of Jesus Christ in 3rd Nephi is very much like, these are the other sheep I have. And granted, it does say, and now I'm going to go see other sheep. So I can understand, like, it's a broader expansion of the overall Christian message. But it is, I think it's uncontestable to say that it is very American centric and United States of American specifically. One of the things that's always I've always wondered about is if I had grown up outside of the States. One of my best mission friends, I think they actually, as a family, know you. I won't mention their name here on the recording. I'll tell you after we're done. But they're also from New Zealand. And so I remember when we were on our missions talking to this other missionary about like, why did the Book of Mormon like connect with you as someone literally completely across the world? So can you give me some insight on why the Book of Mormon's message connected with you as someone who isn't American when it is so American centric in its message?
Yeah, so I mean, I live in New Zealand, and I think the New Zealand and the Pacific in general has a really interesting connection to the Book of Mormon.
Sure.
Generally, well, if you look at New Zealand history, particularly, it was colonized by Britain, and so the predominant racial makeup is that most people are white Europeans in New Zealand, and the indigenous people of New Zealand, Maori people, were effectively colonized, taken over. And so this was a really big deal in the late 1800s and through into the 20th century. So when the missionaries came to New Zealand, one of the ways that they got traction, I believe, was that, at the time, Mormon missionaries were the outer, even in America, right? So they identified themselves with those who were the most marginalized in New Zealand, which happened to be the indigenous Maori people. And so the Maori people saw this as a lifeline for religious observance and maybe even community, and as a contrast to aligning themselves with Britain. America gave another option.
Do you feel like one of the reasons those early missionaries probably did that was because they were viewing the Maori people as like maybe an extension of the Lamanites that had traveled across the sea? Is that how they viewed it at the time? Do you know?
There doesn't seem to be any indication to that, as far as I can tell, then. But that certainly became the case into the 20th century, that there started to become this idea that the Pacific peoples were the descendants of Hagoth, that Hagoth had taken, in Alma chapter 60, had taken the people northward and gone into the West Sea, effectively into the Pacific, and come down and populated Polynesia. And so this became a really great rhetoric to be able to suggest that the Book of Mormon was the heritage of the indigenous Pacific peoples as a whole: Hawaiians, Samoans, Tongans, and Maori, and that became a really fundamental understanding and connection. And because the church offered, an idea that Pacific people were special and chosen, this was a better view of themselves than what the British were giving them as colonial subjects. And by a strange quirk of fate, of course, America became a superpower by the mid-20th century, and that rise and uptick of America meant that the members of the church who were connected to America through this religious thing also got a bit of a rise and tick in New Zealand society. So that's why this American ness is really prominent in New Zealand. And of course, over the years, and I live in Wellington, which is the capital city, so it's government, it's industry, it's business, and it's education. And so the ward I grew up in had always had Americans in them, because we would have people come and work from America in my area. And so the Americans I experienced as a young man were top notch. They were the cream of the cream, because they were really proficient, and they were doing things internationally in New Zealand. So And of course, lots of the missionaries who came would be Americans. So we would have this tie to America. America was also a superpower, and then we would have all of these Americans, from American missionaries through to American business people or educators or governments. So America was very favored. I mean, I ended up marrying an American, which surprisingly upped my status in the church, because I didn't realize that wasn't the reason I married Lindy, of course, but it upped my status really quickly, because God is American, the church is American, and now I was pseudo-American because I had married an American. So yeah, very, very interesting. And
you were adopted into the House of America, I guess we could say.
That's right. I was adopted into the House. And aside from that, I guess one of the things that the Book of Mormon does say is that the Isles of the Sea will be a place of refuge, and where the blessed will be guided to. So lots of the people in the Pacific feel that way about themselves, like that aligns with them. And so actually we kind of go, okay, America's special, but we're even more special because God brought the righteous out of the American continent into the Pacific. And so actually we can tick that box of, okay, America's special and exceptional, but New Zealand, I mean, amazing. So
I always thank you for taking that question. I know it's kind of outside the scope of what we had agreed to talk about, but I just always think back to my time on my mission, and I did serve my mission in the States. And so I did have that advantage of being able to tell people basically, like, even if they had no other interest in religion, like, this is a testament of Jesus Christ's dealings with the people who lived here anciently. And I have often wondered, that connection that you've explained to me now makes sense with New Zealand. But I've often wondered, like, if you serve in Japan, or if you were to serve, somewhere in Europe, it's probably really difficult to get people to care as much about a religion that is so American centric, right? Like, our mutual friend, Radio Free Mormon, served his mission in Japan. And I'm sure it's really difficult to kind of explain the connection that the Book of Mormon has specifically to the Americas. And I just have often wondered, like, what makes it compelling outside of living in the States. So it makes sense now from the perspective of New Zealand through that history and context. Well, let's kind of talk about.
I was going to say one thing to add to that, which might be really useful, is that I live in New Zealand. I grew up in New Zealand, but I have lived in the States, and I noticed that when I was living in the States, I read the Book of Mormon differently. So in New Zealand, when we read the Book of Mormon, we see the Lamanites as the heroes. We see the anti-Nephi Lehis, who put down their weapons of war and were more righteous than the Nephites. We see Samuel the Lamanite, who goes and preaches to the wicked Nephites. We see the fact that the Nephites get destroyed at the very end, and the Lamanites are left because they're less wicked. That's the interpretation that the Book of Mormon is for brown people at the end of the world. But when I lived in the States, I recognized that I read the Book of Mormon differently. I read the Book of Mormon from a white perspective. The Nephites were industrious, and they were militarily superior. Is that even a word? Who's like, and that they were destined to be the rights holders at the end, that everybody would be changed to be white and delightsome, as they embrace the gospel, and that the heroes, the grand heroes of the Book of Mormon, were these prophets who were Nephites. And so I saw a lot of this American culture exemplified in the perspective of the Nephites as I read the Book of Mormon in the United States, as opposed to the indigenous peoples who were maybe slightly marginalized that I read the Book of Mormon in New Zealand.
That's interesting. Well, shifting back to our conversation about Book of Mormon authorship, let me ask you this question. What do you feel like there's so many areas where even other people who don't necessarily view Joseph Smith as a prophet, I feel like often get in this space where they talk past each other, right? And I guess my question for you is when people are talking about Book of Mormon authorship, from your perspective, what type of conversation is that really? Because I think one of the areas that we see this talking past each other is that Book of Mormon authorship can really be viewed as a question about history. It's a historical question. It can be a question of faith. It can be a question of identity, like how do I fit in the system, kind of as you've just shared about how the Book of Mormon connected with the Maori people. It's also a claim about institutional authority. So, where do you land on the question of Book of Mormon authorship, and what type of question is it?
Yeah, look, there's so much in that question. You know, one of the things I think that is important about the Book of Mormon is that we actually physically have it. You know, like it's an artifact. It's an artifact that makes members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints different from other Christian denominations, other Protestants, particularly. And it, you know, like it's physical. You can hold it in your hands. You can thumb through its text. You can read it devotionally and feel connected to it. And I think it does make members of the church feel unique. You know, it really is Scripture in ways that other American Protestant groups may not have. Like, you know, the Seventh-day Adventists have the writings of Ellen G. White, and for many people in that grouping, they see Ellen G. White's writings as prophetic, as Scripture, but it's not quite in the same way that that Mormons view the Book of Mormon as Scripture, as a nod from God that they have the truth. And so that's why it becomes such a interesting endeavor that you're talking about this particular artifact, the Book of Mormon, but actually from a member's perspective, what it says is God knows who we are, reached out through the cosmos to speak through Joseph and deliver this unique book to us. We are special. For people who are outside the church, other Christians, but also maybe just interested parties, it's just it's an artifact that says this places this group of people in this time period as, you know, distinguishing themselves from others. You know, they're not reading the Book of Mormon as a divine mandate that these people are correct. They're reading the Book of Mormon as this is the point at which this group, differentiated from the groups around it. And so, of course, the way that then you might approach the Book of Mormon is going to be quite different. If you are a member of the church, you're going to want to see it as history, as ancient, as messages from God, and that it establishes a prophetic tradition in the church. Those are the kinds of ways that you're looking at the Book of Mormon and you're affirming your belief based on it. If you're outside the church, or maybe even post-Mormon, you're going, okay, well, how does this distinguish Latter-day Saints from other Christian communities, other Protestant groups of early 19th century America? And what does it tell us about the time period and the people involved, including Joseph? And that may also include what's his agenda, how is he influencing people around him, why are people buying into this, and what do we learn about him or the environment that will explain what it is that we have, and harkening back to Dan McClellan, the idea of this is a 19th century text that is written to a 19th century audience. And so if you want to understand it, you need to understand it through a 19th century context. So, most people outside the church are looking at it that way, but it forms it's still an artifact, right? It informs a particular way of thinking at a particular time. And that's really fascinating, especially since, the church has become incredibly wealthy. It occupies a really central place in US society, but also, in Utah as a state that kind of is in mid-America. And also in this, war of religion and the United States as a bastion of particularly Christian religious observance and, base or foundation in the world, it becomes a very important one. So, so basically people can talk past each other because they're talking about things from completely different ways. One from a devotional aspect of this establishes my right to have this faith, and another suggesting, okay, how do we understand Mormonism in the context of America and the time period that and how it's relevant today. So these are so you can easily just not talk to each other.
And then as far as your personal working theory or belief about Book of Mormon authorship, if I'm understanding you, you are, like me, a sole author theorist. You believe that Joseph Smith was fully capable of writing the Book of Mormon. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So, and a lot of my book actually puts that forward because I see so much of Joseph in the Book of Mormon. His environment,
right,
his family dynamics, his own personal events, they are all embedded in the Book of Mormon. And I can tie them to, what's going on at the particular time. So, and that's what every chapter does, with those contexts and those understandings is go, oh, well, this seats, the only person who could have written it is Joseph, because he's the only one who satisfies all of the criteria. The fact that it's, it's written from a marginalized perspective. It's written from somebody who's got less power than the organizations of the day, both politically, religiously, and also civically. So, and that's definitely Joseph's experience at that time. And that's different to when he's in Nauvoo, where he is the political leader, he is the civic leader, he is the religious leader, and he's controlling everything. That's why it's so different. What's happening in 1829 as opposed to what's happening in 1844. I'm sorry. No.
I was just going to say, it is one of the things that's most interesting to me about Mormon history is that the Book of Mormon is the faith's foundational book of scripture. But if you really compare like the doctrines that most people, including people who are members of the church, think about as defining Mormonism, I would say almost none of them can actually be found in the Book of Mormon. Our mutual friend, Steve Pinecker, is an evangelical that talks about Mormonism all the time. He's never been a Mormon. And he often has said to me that the Book of Mormon, at least what's in it theologically and scripturally, poses no issue for his evangelical position, meaning that it's more aligned with evangelical positions today. And I think even in Joseph Smith's day, than it is with like what most people would think of when they think of Mormonism, which you already hinted at, polygamy. There are other elements that we could talk about. Obviously, the temple ceremony. Temples are a feature in the Book of Mormon, but they're really not anywhere close to the feature we see reflected in Mormonism today, or even Mormonism in the Kirtland and Nauvoo periods. So that is one of the things that's so interesting to me about the Book of Mormon. You use the phrase, it's almost like a time capsule, right? It's like a time capsule of Joseph Smith's theology at a very particular time in his life. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting to me are the changes between the original 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon and the 1837 is the next edition, where we see changes in, I would say, the theology, at least as far as the concept of the Godhead is concerned. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I think that's one of the things that's very interesting to me about the Book of Mormon, is that it basically, even though most people know that the Book of Mormon is what originates Mormonism largely, it really isn't where you can find, I would say, the foundational theology of Mormonism. That really is later development and more articulated in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah, and that's precisely what my book is about, is that, the Book of Mormon is Joseph in 1829 as a 23-year-old, the kinds of thoughts he's having, and they're very aligned with, early 19th century American religious expression. And one of the clearest examples of that is speaking in tongues, because speaking in tongues is a major feature of the early church. It's actually in the Book of Mormon. It's just that we, later we don't view it as that. But when you
Sure.
take that idea, that topic, and you dissect it out, you see that actually that's a big part of what's going on in Joseph's environment. That's what gets written into the Book of Mormon. And then the expression of that happens in the early church. And this really changes by about 1836. And it's really kind of on the down low by Nauvoo. And then it really kind of fades out from there. So, but the early church is replete with people speaking in tongues. This is a major feature of the early church, and it's pretty much almost gone entirely by Nauvoo for lots of different reasons. But one of the biggest ones is that Joseph changes, and the ways that speaking in tongues, it's a charismatic gift, but it's also it's really difficult to control, and anybody can have it. And that doesn't work well. That works well with an egalitarian idea that everybody contributes. Everybody has a gift and they bring that to the table. But it doesn't really work very well in a hierarchy where you want to have some measure of authority over the people underneath you. If they're getting revelation through speaking in tongues, and that undermines the fact that you have authority, so that's why it gets squashed. But yeah, that's the basis and premise for my book, and all of the examples I give are basically that is, and the clearest one is baptism for the dead. The Book of Mormon doesn't have that in it, of course, but it also speaks against baptism for the dead, because really the Book of Mormon's theology with regard to what happens when you die is that same spirit which you die with is the same spirit which inhabits you for the rest of your life. That's
right.
Well, for the rest of your eternity, your afterlife. That is what happens. And so Joseph posits in the Book of Mormon, it suggests the people that are saved are those who repent and find Christ, or they're ignorant of the law, so therefore they can't be held under condemnation of the law, or they're innocent because they're a baby or a child. So innocent, ignorant, or they repent. Those are the only people who go to heaven. But by 1840, we see this change to baptism for the dead, and the idea that you can do these ordinances on behalf of somebody who's been before, but for whatever reason missed out on getting a Mormon baptism. That is a major development, major pivot, and there's some really good reasons for that. I have a whole chapter on that in the Book of Mormon. I mean, in my book. Yeah, those are the things that are key. If you talk to any youth and you said, well, what is it that's special to you about the church? Well, that's unique to your friends, probably is baptism for the dead, going to the temple, performing a baptism for the dead. That is not what any other church or any other space in their life is doing. But it's and that only happened in 1840. That didn't happen before then, and it's talked against in the Book of Mormon. So, yeah, really interesting developments.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I think kind of with that framing, let's start talking about the Book of Mormon in more detail as an autobiographical artifact of
Okay.
both the 19th century and then its author.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's so much to look at this, but this is what I think is really fun, Colby. I guess this is what keeps me up at night or thinking, and what is happening? What's going on here? And how can we test it? One of the things I've really appreciated about you is that you have these lovely parts of yourself which lend really well to this kind of inquiry, and I think we share them, and that is, you've got this basis in law, which is logic, it's debate, but it's also proving, trying to understand what is going on. And I've got a commercial law degree as well, and then you've got the science background, which says, okay, well, how do we test it? How do we refine that testing? How can we replicate that understanding and figure out whether this is a real thing or just something that we're imagining? What's our hypothesis? What's our test? What are our results? And is this replicatable? Is this repeatable? And that gives you a measure of reliability that things are going on. And then I think it's something that you and I probably also share. So I've got a science background as well, but is that idea of people, that, hey, how do people interpret this? What is the relationships that are going on? How do we connect with other people, or what are the things that brings us together or distances us? How can we have better conversations so that we appreciate each other's perspective, but so that we can walk away with a lot of love and empathy, even if we disagree, which I think is, obviously the title of your channel. And those three aspects of your personality and your background, and they're ones that I share in slightly different ways, are mean that hopefully you have really, when you're looking at things, you're going, your brain is going, okay, if I can take the emotion out of this, what am I seeing? What can I test? How do I even measure this? And then there's the implementation. Okay, well, this might be hard because it flies in the face of what we know already or what we believe about ourselves or about others. How do we bridge the gap when there's an emotional distance? Those are some cool things.
Yeah, no, I did not know you had a background in law also. So that's awesome that we're going to share so many of those common interests and goals. I think you just have a much more charming accent than I do. So you've got an inherent advantage there. But one of the things that's interesting to me about Book of Mormon authorship, so I don't know I've talked about it on this channel yet, but I will be doing a presentation at Sunstone this year, which really is analyzing, I would say, the apologetics that I grew up with, but they're still commonly used today regarding Book of Mormon authorship. And it really revolves around this 1879 quote from Emma Smith about how Joseph Smith could neither write nor dictate a well-worded letter. I know you're very well acquainted with that. All of us who grew up in the church are used to hearing that idea. And I am interested in looking at that question in the sense of, to me, it is a very interesting methodological point. It's interesting to me that for generations, there have been people who know that quote and take Emma's word for Joseph Smith's writing capability when we have letters from Joseph Smith from the same year that the Book of Mormon was dictated, right? We have two letters that he wrote to the Colesville Saints, and then one that he wrote to Oliver Cowdery in 1829 and 1830. And it's just such an interesting epistemological, methodological point to me to think about the reality that why in the world would anyone be taking Emma Smith's word for Joseph Smith's writing capability, particularly when in that same testimony, we know that to me, the word lie connotes an intention to deceive. I truly don't know if Emma had an intention to deceive, but I would put it this way. We know that there are at least untruths in Emma's testimony regarding the question of polygamy and Joseph Smith's involvement in polygamy in that same exact 2-page interview that she had with Joseph Smith III in 1879. So that is where I'm coming at in Sunstone at the end of this month, where I'll be presenting on this question. But to me, I have come to terms with the fact that we probably will likely not be able to explain exactly where all the elements of the Book of Mormon come from. The best resource we would have to do that is the original manuscript, and comparing the original manuscript to the printer's manuscript and any other notes that we have. We have some of those things for the Book of Abraham. That's one of the reasons I feel more confident talking about the Book of Abraham's translation process. When it comes to the Book of Mormon, for people who don't know, the reality is that we have 28% of the original manuscript, if I remember the number correctly, right? It was placed in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house. It was damaged by water. And even though the original manuscript can tell us some really interesting things, for example, there are more people involved as scribes, at least according to handwriting analysis, than I had known about or I grew up knowing about, right? I learned about Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and Emma Smith largely. And there are more people to this day who their handwriting remains undetermined, right? There are other scribes that were part of this project in the original manuscript that we don't know about. But I guess I'm just framing this to say I'm interested in Book of Mormon authorship, but I come at it from a position of agnosticism, but with a strong belief that the default is that Joseph Smith is capable of being its author when we look at those two 1830 letters. And I think that's one of the reasons that we wanted to have this conversation today about the Book of Mormon and where it comes from. So like you, I view Book of Mormon authorship as a historical question, as a literary question, as a writing capability question. And I love that your first slide here connects with Mosiah priority, because I really feel like you cannot understand the Book of Mormon and you cannot understand Joseph Smith's relationship to the Book of Mormon until you understand Mosiah priority, which is a theory posited by Brent Metcalf that is basically so well evidenced, in my view, that even apologists rely on the Mosiah priority theory when they're doing their work on the Book of Mormon.
Yes.
I've said there. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that Brent didn't first posit this. I mean, the Mosiah priority was known well before Brent did his work. But one of the things that he did, which he did incredibly well, was to show that Joseph was involved in the text of the Book of Mormon, and he did so by showing that things like word choices, therefore and wherefore, which are synonymous words, changed during the dictation process and aligned with the Mosiah priority. So Joseph used the therefore in the first part of the Book of Mormon, and then wherefore predominantly in the latter part of the Book of Mormon. And so this established the Mosiah priority to be correct. But more importantly, and probably damning from the church's point of view at the time, which is why he got excommunicated, was that showed Joseph as an author, because his word choice made a difference. Like it's a synonymous word, so it shouldn't, it doesn't make a physical difference to the theology, but it made a difference to the fact that it was coming. The Book of Mormon was coming out of his mouth and being changed by him for various circumstances, which made him an author. This flew in the face of the idea that the words were appearing and he was just saying the words that he was seeing. The Brent Metcalf's work and the compilation, because it included a whole lot of other people's work as well, and they showed other points along that Mosiah priority where theology also changed depending on the Mosiah priority. So the people in the Book of Mosiah didn't know that Christ was going to visit the Americas. And then, of course, 3rd Nephi has Christ visiting, and then Nephi in the replacement text knows that Christ is going to visit, and says that specifically. So this also showed that the text of the Book of Mormon over the Mosiah priority was changing. The theology was changing, the ideas were changing, the events were changing. And if you understood that those things were changing during the course of the dictation sequence, that put into extreme doubt that this was an ancient record or a historical one, because it suggested that the text of the Book of Mormon was dependent on the time that it was dictated, not on some distant ancient event. So that was,
which really I think is what you have here at the top, right? It is an autobiographical artifact, and we can see Joseph Smith's fingerprints on it, I think, so clearly. Like you said, I always try and be wary of bias, but to me, all of the theories around whether it's Spalding-Rigdon manuscript theory or even some theories trying to, it's an interesting thing to me, right? Because there are believers who believe Joseph Smith was not capable of writing the Book of Mormon and will make that case. And they will usually do that talking about the quote that I'm going to respond to. It's Sunstone from Emma. They'll use quotes from Lucy Mack about Joseph Smith's education and his disinclination for book learning. I think she's being very convenient with how she phrases those things, is the way I would put it. And then we have believers basically using that to do what I would say almost like a God of the gaps type argument, right? Like, if we can't explain it, therefore Joseph Smith must have had this divine help in rendering this text. On the flip side, I feel like there are people on the ex-Mormon or post-Mormon side, or even the never-Mormon and Christian side, that will say Joseph Smith also wasn't capable of writing the Book of Mormon, so it was Sidney Rigdon, or it was Solomon Spalding through Sidney Rigdon, or it was someone else entirely. Like, I've heard people talk about how they think Hiram was way more involved than other people give credit for. It's an interesting convergence between two diametrically opposed positions to me, right? Like, there are non-believers in the text and there are believers in the text that both simultaneously believe that Joseph Smith was not capable of creating the text. And it just is a weird thing to me. What do you think is behind, obviously, the believing and the faithful community? I don't necessarily want to go there. Faith questions to me are not all that interesting, in the sense that they're basically, you believe them or you don't. Why do you think there are so many people that have been interested from the ex-Mormon, post-Mormon, never-Mormon side of the equation that basically cannot wrap their heads around Joseph Smith being the author of the Book of Mormon? What, as you've engaged with some of those arguments, have you felt like is behind that movement?
One of the things, particularly in the post-Mormon kind of space, I think has to do with three kind of things. One is that, firstly, most people think they're incredibly intelligent. That's just our bias. We think we're intelligent. That's how we are. So when you come to know that the church isn't what it's claimed to be, that's a big shock, right? Because you were intelligent, or felt like you were intelligent, and you believed this for a great deal of time. So the only way to reconcile those two contradictions, I'm intelligent, but I've been duped, is to suggest that that somebody has to have gone to a lot of trouble to dupe you. They really, they had to conspire to do so, to dupe you, because you're an intelligent person, right? So you're not going to fall for simple scams, but if you're intelligent and you effectively fell for a scam, well, then it must have been a really a really specific or intricate conspiracy against you, right? And so So therefore,
Can
you
I
have to
give
find.
you can I give you one that I've Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to give you one that I've seen also, which is I do feel like there are a lot of people who leave the church and completely understandably, right? They feel like they've been harmed by the church. They've been harmed by Joseph Smith in particular. And I feel like there are some people who these theories connect with them because it's easier to believe some of these theories, which are literally conspiracy theories, like Solomon Spalding, Rigdon manuscript theorists. There is a necessary conspiracy involving multiple people. This is not me just insulting the thinking pattern. It is part and parcel of being a Spalding Rigdon manuscript theorist, is that you must believe in at least some form of conspiracy to create the Book of Mormon that way. I feel like one of the reasons people find that argument compelling is because they do not want to believe anything good about Joseph Smith. They do not want to believe that he was smart enough to write the Book of Mormon,
Right.
that he was theologically sophisticated enough to come up with the Book of Mormon. So it must have been somebody else. I don't know. Have you ever considered that angle, or have you seen that angle the same way I have?
Yeah, and I think that's generally the position of people who are not members of the church, who are looking at the Book of Mormon and going, this seems sophisticated at some level, and I just don't see or feel like Joseph is sophisticated. Either doesn't come across like that, or he's just, I don't want to think that I could have been. That something so significant has come from somebody so lowly. It's
Right.
maybe even a position of bias, privilege bias.
And I
would
feel like
also
that
suggest.
connects really. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that that's also probably the same reason that the whole polygamy denier stuff happens too, right? Because you go, hang on, there are these terrible things about Joseph in the historic record. It just are. So I either have to believe that Joseph is not the person that I have felt incredibly close to. He's a monster, or I can explain that somebody after him, Brigham Young and others, have conspired to besmirch Joseph's name and take the church in a direction of selfish perversion, and then that's a way of explaining why I feel good about Joseph, but there are these terrible things in the historic record.
No, I think that is a very good explanation. The polygamy denier movement to me is a very interesting one, because it is, at least as far as I know, not supported by legitimately a single, scholar that studies history. That is not to discount the efforts of folks like Michelle Stone or Jeremy Hoop. They know a lot about very particular sets of documents. However, I think they often miss the forest for the trees and also ignore the reality that the church, including in Joseph Smith's day, was always rewriting its history. Joseph Smith wrote an 1832 version of his history. He wrote, he started how many different versions of the church's history, which are contradictory, right? We could talk about the 1832, 1838 first vision accounts, as well as later first vision accounts. So to me, it's very funny that they will often find this pattern of documents being modified, changed, or the time period that they're supposed to come from being messed with. And they'll attribute all of that to everyone but Joseph Smith, which is funny to me because I see that very much in Joseph Smith dealing with the records and dealing with his own history very clearly. So, for what it's worth, I guess that probably leads us right to this slide where we deal with the two different Josephs. And I think we've talked about a lot of this already, but I'll go ahead and read some of the material you have here on 1829, and then we'll allow you to talk about the 1844 version of Joseph. Obviously, Joseph in 1829, when he's dealing with the Book of Mormon, has a clear position against polygamy, against kings. It is also one of the things to me about the Book of Mormon that is such a clear indication that it is not an ancient text, is it's reconciling with ideas about democracy. Obviously, democracy is way older than America, but the way it comes at principles like freedom, liberty are very, very centralized on the founding of America. And if I'm just looking at it, like you talked about, the commonality that we share, looking at it as a historical question or like a scientist would, I think it is much more likely that those ideas are attributable to someone coming from Joseph Smith's time period and with Joseph Smith's perspective than that ancient Hebrews that have only ever really known tribal warfare and kings somehow find themselves centuries before the American Revolution and the ideas of the Enlightenment, and basically echoing the same time period, or ideas from that same time period about freedom and about liberty. Egalitarian, anti-wealth, anti-secret combinations. I know that Dan Vogel believes very strongly. I'm a lot more mixed on this question. I just am sincerely not that interested in it, that the Book of Mormon is very anti-Masonic, relying on or responding to the William Morgan situation. And then obviously the Book of Mormon is very heavily reliant on folk magic elements from Joseph Smith's worldview, including building in sinking, disappearing treasures. Oh, nice. You've got your seer stone here. Let me make us bigger here for a moment. There we go.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah,
that's my seer stone that I got from Brent Medcalf and Aaron Medcalf. They gave this to me. It's a replica. It's got a little hole in the bottom.
That's awesome.
But it's plastic. It's 3D printed. But yeah, this is the only artifact we have of the Book of Mormon. And you're talking about Emma Smith's account in 1879. Well, she talks about seer stone in the hat.
Mm-hmm.
Way back then, but that is never, and I guess part of what you're going to talk about is the idea of, okay, well, trying to present the history of the church in a particular way, you might include some understandings and not others, depending on where in the time frame you are and what kinds of things you're trying to, promote, right, or, yeah. So slide.
Exactly. Did you have anything more on the 1844 version of Joseph that you wanted to talk about? Or I think we probably covered most of it, right?
Yeah, these are all really clear and clever. And there are dozens of others. I mean, that's the basis of the book. I would suggest I do have a chapter on secret combinations and its development, and and there are some really clear indications that it's connected to anti-Masonic understanding of and around 1829, and some of the ways that it changes during Joseph's life are really fascinating. Some of the things that surprised me a great deal, because we often talk about the contrast between the anti-secret combinations and then the temple endowment in Nauvoo, but one of the fun things, or at least they're awful, but they're interesting, is that Joseph did a lot of threats to do with violence through the Ohio period that kind of solidified in Missouri in 1838, and then morphed into Nauvoo, and these were Masonic related, but they didn't solidify into Masonry until 1842 for Joseph personally. There are other people around him engaging in Masonry prior to and then after. But one of the things I think members of the church do not know is that Joseph Smith joined Masonry in 1842 officially, and the Nauvoo Lodge was a major part of Nauvoo society. It's a fraternity, only men went, of course. But this is a massive deal. Throughout his journal entries, he's going to the Masonic Lodge regularly. This is a major part of his identity at the end of the Nauvoo period. So it's massive. And the only reason it doesn't kind of carry through to Utah is that Brigham Young can't get a charter for Masonry in Utah. So so it kind of divorces in that Utah period. So Masonry doesn't become a big feature of the church going forward. But Joseph had his Masonic apron. You can see a picture of it. I I wasn't allowed to utilize it in my book. The church wouldn't let me, but you can see it.
They take their copyrights very seriously. I'll tell you that, Ganesh. So,
but it's the story of masonry in the early church and in Joseph's life is a really fascinating one. I guess you asked me that question about what I found so interesting in Joseph's life, and masonry was definitely one of them. That the chapter I have on that, I think, is profound and enlightening, and really, it changed my my views completely.
I'm going to have to read that chapter then, because I know I haven't. Probably because in the past I just have kind of set it on the shelf of just not being as interested in it. But with that pitch, I feel like I will definitely have to check it out. So one of the elements then we see of these fingerprints of Joseph Smith is obviously the blueprints for a church. And you have it here in Moroni 2-6. We've got the exact sacrament prayers. We've got specific baptismal instructions. One of the things that's always been interesting to me, whether it's the question of the sacrament prayers, the specific baptismal instructions, or even the injunction against infant baptisms, is one of the apologetics that members of the church will often use to excuse the church's, century plus of exclusion of members of the Black race from, I'm not going to say Black race, excuse me. I'm going to edit this out. One of the apologetics that we will see that members of the church will use to excuse the church's history of racism and exclusion towards Black members of the church is that God can only work with prophets who ask him very particular questions, right? I'm sure you've heard that idea before. And one of the things that's been so interesting to me when you compare apologetic theories to different parts of different problems or different issues in the church is I don't understand how, when Mormon and Moroni are supposedly like the last two people who are righteous, who would be priesthood holders, that they are ever thinking about these particular questions. So I like the way you have it presented here with basically like, this is near the end of the Book of Mormon's dictation period. This is where you have here Oliver is pushing to formally organize a church. Tell me how we know some of those things, or what led you to these conclusions.
The Mosiah priority is, when you look at it and you're trying to understand what's going on, there are some real big developments. And one of the biggest developments is the idea of church in the Book of Mormon. And it happens so early in the dictation sequence that you don't really notice it. But there are some really big clues. And one is that if you go and have a look at King Benjamin, who's the first kind of preacher in the Mosiah priority, and you look at Abinadi, those two preachers advocate a relationship with Christ, but it doesn't include baptism. It doesn't include any formal membership at all. This only starts to happen in Mosiah chapter 18 when Alma starts baptizing, and then at the end of Mosiah and effectively organizing a church. And then later when Alma unites with King Mosiah gives him the charge to make churches in Zarahemla. There are no churches in Zarahemla prior to the end of the Book of Mosiah and with Alma. And this is because Joseph wasn't envisioning a church. He'd already had some kind of Christian experience and conversion by this point, which is much like the King Benjamin revival conversion, the idea of being convicted of your sins and inviting Christ into your life. But the idea of an organization that supports that is not in the beginning of the Mosiah priority. It only comes up at the end of the Book of Mosiah and onwards. And so and I think that this has to do with the audience, the scribe, particularly Oliver Cowdery, that he is engaging in this work. And of course, Oliver and Joseph are talking about this every single day. I think that I think there's good evidence to suggest that each evening they're looking over the dictated text. They're talking about it in the household, and they're in harmony at this particular point. They then move to Fayette. The household makes a huge difference because they're chatting over what they've just dictated and recorded, and this is now becoming the understanding. And so, and Joseph is adapting to his circumstance, to his audience, finding out the things that are important to them. And church is important to Oliver Cowdery. Baptism is important to Oliver Cowdery. So these things start to make their way into the text. And aside from the Book of Mormon, one of the other things that we know is that in June of 1829, we have Doctrine and Covenants, section 18, which is where Joseph gets a revelation for Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer to start the church. And Oliver gets a revelation called the Articles and Covenants from Jesus. He's receiving revelation. And he takes these parts of the Book of Mormon, he puts it into his revelation, and this revelation is then the way that the church is moving forward. David Whitmer, in his address to all believers, says the church wasn't organized in April 6th, 1830. It happened organically right at the moment the Book of Mormon was being finished in June, July. They were all preaching, converting, baptizing. That was all happening right then and there. It was only just formalized in April of 1829. The church was being headed by and administered and grown by Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, some of the other Whitmer brothers, and some of the other Smith brothers. So that's what was happening.
Let me jump in right there for a second, if you can pause that thought. And because I know there would be some people who hear you say that Joseph and Oliver, and were they with the Whitmers at this point that we're talking about?
In Mosiah, they're not. They're just in harmony.
Okay, they're in harmony. Okay,
they're not in Fayette till Mormon, Ether, Moroni, and the replacement text.
When they're setting up the church structure here. Okay, that helps me. Thank you. Some people might hear you talk about the people involved in the translation process, reviewing the text or talking about the text, and think like, oh, that differs from what I've heard historically. I think I would push back on their potential pushback and support you by saying, we know that Joseph Smith and Oliver get baptized in response to what they're doing with the Book of Mormon's translation. So this theory, I think, connects with that very well. I also think it's just very common sense. And the important thing I want to say is it doesn't require any belief that there's any lack of sincerity on either Joseph or anyone else involved in this project at this point. That, of course, if they're receiving new scripture, if they're receiving revelation, they are going to be excited and talking about that and wanting to draw the lessons that they can from it, exactly like they did in the instance of baptism. I'm not sure if you agree with that, but I wanted to be your second witness.
We're having a very hard time in this podcast, Colby, of disagreeing, and that's the whole premise of the title of this podcast. So I feel like I'm not a great guest, because yes,
that's okay.
I absolutely agree with you.
That's okay. It's also titled "And Other Interesting Conversations" because I've realized I actually haven't had a ton of disagreement on this channel yet, but I think we're still talking about it because there is a ton of disagreement on the topic. And so even if you and I don't necessarily disagree, I know there will be people who disagree with the things we say on the topic. That is for sure.
We could do a whole podcast on this, and I've done some similar with Mormonish, basically showing that the formation of the church is a bit of an accident. Like it really, you can see it in the Mosiah priority of the text of the Book of Mormon. You can see it in the events of the end of the production of the Book of Mormon in Fayette, New York, and in the ways that the church, or the events unfold between June of 1829 and April 6th of 1830. Now that's 9 months. That's not any small period of time, right? So the fact that there are things going on then, and that they make a difference to what happens by April of 1830 is really key. And of course, it's just a bit of a black box for most people because they've never actually thought or talked about it. You know, we always talk about the idea that it took 3 months for the Book of Mormon from basically April through to June. We never talk about the fact that it took almost 7 months from the time that the Book of Mormon was, the dictation was finished, through to the time that it was published, and that the printer's manuscript, you know how you were talking earlier about the original manuscript and the printer's manuscript, this is being done continuously. Like the printer's manuscript was produced in 7 months over time as it was being delivered to the printer. This is massive. We never we talk about the 3 months, dictation. We don't talk about the 7 months for the second iteration of the Book of Mormon manuscript text. Why is it taking so long? What are they doing at the same time? Are there revisions going on? What is, we don't have much of the original manuscript, so we don't know how different they are, but what improvements are being made to the original manuscript for it to even get to the printer. We do know when it gets to the printer has to add punctuation, so that's a major improvement in an editorial process. What the claim that the Book of Mormon has no editorial changes is incorrect. We've got 7 to 8 months of editorial improvements, changes, enlightenments that basically Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith are doing to the printer's manuscript. So this is, and it's a black box. Nobody knows exactly what's happening here.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. Another one of those interesting methodological points to me about all of this is when an apologist or someone says, all the edits to the Book of Mormon have basically been grammatical. The reality is we do not know if that is the case. Now, do I think that likely is the case? Yes, I actually do. But the reality is that the best evidence that we would have of what the original Book of Mormon, like the words that Joseph Smith dictated while he was looking at the rock in the hat, the best evidence of that would be the original manuscript. And the reality is we only have 28% of it, as far as I remember the number. And the best evidence to figure out what's going on with the Book of Mormon and the changes would be to look at the original manuscript compared to the printer's manuscript, and then obviously to compare the printer's manuscript to the original published version and look at all three of those. We cannot do that. And again, it's just an interesting methodological point to me that some people are very willing to represent something that the bottom line is we really cannot know because of the limitations we have with accessing that original manuscript based on the way it was treated historically.
Yeah, it's look, and again, we could have a whole podcast just on this, but I think that one of the clues that this goes into a little rabbit hole, but it's a fun rabbit hole. I'll say it briefly, and maybe we can talk about it later.
Sure.
In August of 1829, Joseph and Martin Harris secure a contract with Grandin for the printing of the Book of Mormon. It's 5,000 copies for $3,000, so 66 cents per copy. But in David Whitmer's address to all believers, he says that in January of, at the same time of August, Martin Harris takes out a mortgage on his farm for $3,000. So this seems to be secure. This is an idea of that this is all good. But David Whitmer, in his address to all believers, much later, he says that by January, February of 1830, they are worried about money because the printer wants more money. We don't know much about this. This hasn't been researched very well, and I don't know what the situation is, but it seems to me that it could well be that the printer's manuscript is larger than the original manuscript, that the printer is saying, hang on a second, I've priced this on these amount of pages, and it's coming to the end of the production, and there's more pages than we have originally done it on, which is why Martin's being pressed again for more money and to satisfy the printing of the Book of Mormon. So that would suggest to me that there is a difference between the page count of the original manuscript, which they might have, they've done their contract on, and the printer's manuscript, which has been delivered to the printer for printing. And there's a discrepancy there. So why is there more pages? Well, there's possibly more information in the printer's manuscript than the original manuscript, and we just don't know because we don't have the original manuscript.
Yeah. Wow, that is an interesting rabbit hole. So I think we've talked a lot about how the text then evolves as they get to Fayette, how they're responding to some of the contemporary needs, or Joseph is responding to some of the contemporary needs in Fayette. But I wanted to give you a chance to cover this slide.
Yeah, so when we talked a little bit before about the therefore, wherefore switch that Brent Metcalf so eloquently documented in his 1993 book, New Approaches to the Book of Mormon. One of the things that he showed as well was that change from therefore to wherefore happened in the Doctrine and Covenants, and at the same time, because remember they're basically the first 20 revelations, or those first revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, happen at the time that the Book of Mormon is being produced. And
which would, I would say, very clearly indicate, again, this is not just ancient authors' voices or Solomon Spaulding's voice, because those revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, they're not contested that they belong to Joseph Smith, that Joseph Smith is the producer of those revelations. Do I have that right?
Yes, correct. And the same therefore, wherefore switch happens in the Doctrine and Covenants, and it happens in Doctrine and Covenants section 14, which is when Joseph gives a revelation to David Whitmer. And we don't see it in Doctrine and Covenants section 12, where Joseph is giving a revelation to his brother Hiram in Harmony, Pennsylvania in May. So one of the things that we can date this change, the change in the wording, happens basically when Joseph goes to Fayette, and we can actually date this in the Book of Mormon too. This only starts to appear really in Ether. So around Mormon and Ether, this switch happens. So we can tell that Joseph is getting. My understanding and the way that I look at it is that 4th Nephi is the end of the Book of Mormon. Joseph does this one chapter, 4th Nephi, that covers 300 years, and that's because he needs to leave Harmony, Pennsylvania. Just has to. Okay, here we go. Yeah,
I think you built this out on this slide. Yep.
This is great. So he has to. 4th Nephi just covers 300 years in one chapter. That's crazy. Why is this happening? Well, we know at the end of 4th Nephi that Ammoron buries the record, and I believe things have got bad in Harmony. Joseph and Oliver need to leave. Oliver's asked his friend David Whitmer to come and rescue them, which he does. But Joseph doesn't know the Whitmers. He hasn't ever met them. They've been corresponding back and forth to Oliver. He doesn't know what situation he's going to find himself in Fayette. He's expecting to be reunited with the lost manuscript, and the project is done. So Ammoron hides the record, and that's the end of the Book of Mormon. He's going to get to to New York. He's going to recover the manuscript from Martin, who's holding out on him, and the Book of Mormon's going to be published. That's it. But two things happen that he doesn't anticipate. One is that he gets to the Whitmers, and they are believers. They've been converted by Oliver's letters, and they're really excited about, what this thing means, what this project means. And the other problem he has is he can't, no matter how hard he tries, and no matter how powerful his seer stone is, he still can't find the lost manuscript, and he has to replace it. So one of the and this change that Brent Metcalf documented with Therefore and Wherefore, and that suggests a vernacular change between Harmony, Pennsylvania, and Fayette. The idea that Joseph is such a sponge, he's so attuned to his environment that whatever is happening in Fayette is changing his text. It's changing the way he speaks, and it's also changing his the ideas that are present. So, and there's a few of these that we can see and document in the text really easily. The first one is there's another here. The first one is that there's the anti-Catholic material starts to happen in the Book of Mormon. It happens in Mormon. It happens in Moroni.
I think you have here, right?
Yes,
Moroni
yes.
8. Yeah, the Whitmers are German reformers with deep anti-Catholic prejudices, and then we suddenly see this big response to Catholicism in Moroni, and then obviously it will continue on in First Nephi. Exactly.
So and it also includes the Doctrine and Covenants, because the great the Church of the Devil is described in the Doctrine and Covenants, 2 revelations that are given to the Whitmers. So these are really good tells that Joseph is responding to his environment. He's considering the audience's thoughts and ideas and embedding them into the text. So that's a really a big one. And the other one is that happens from Mormon onwards, is that the authors address the audience. So this is second person narrative. So first person narrative, of course, is I, Ganesh. Third person narrative is Ganesh did this. And the second person narrative is, oh, hey, I, Ganesh, am talking to you, the audience, the reader, and the Book of Mormon authors start talking to the audience and justifying why they're saying the things that they're doing. They're compelling them, persuading them, talking to them directly as the future, and that's what we see with Mormon, and then especially Moroni. Moroni likes to talk to the audience. I've seen your day. I've seen this particular thing. I've seen how you're going to receive the Book of Mormon. It's not good, so here's some counters.
Therefore, I would exhort you, right?
I would exhort you, yes. And then of course the authors, when they sign off, they bid farewell. Farewell, I will see you at the pleasing bar of God. This is Moroni, this is Nephi, this is Jacob. So that second person narrative is a new way. I think Joseph has discovered a new voice, and then he's employing it from then on. And this happens in the Mosiah priority sequence. But it also happens to coincide with a lot of criticism. And one of the criticisms that he's been able to be apart from when he's in Harmony, that he now is in his face in New York, is that his extended Smith family are balking at this project. We only have one letter, but the letter tells us that there are other letters.
This is the one from Uncle Jesse, is that right?
Uncle Jesse Smith. He's Joseph's favorite uncle. He took care of Joseph when he was lame. He's kind of the patriarch of the family, because even though Azel is still alive, Uncle Jesse is the voice of the family. And Uncle Jesse's letter to the Smith family, to Hiram particularly, is scathing of this project. And then we see people like Moroni in Mormon chapter 8 and 9, directly confronting these criticisms. So the text is dynamic. The text is real time. The text is, these criticisms that Joseph is facing, he's now responding to from ancient authors who know how the text is going to be received, and they're speaking in second person because they're seeing our day. This is dynamic. It's amazing, but it's also, documentable.
So here's another example that you've built out where this obviously would be, where would this have taken place in the dictation order? Oh, in March of 1829. Okay. Yeah. So where King Benjamin, walk us through this other example, I guess, of the text being basically a response to Joseph Smith's contemporary needs.
So you talked about a bit before about Dan Vogel and his making of a prophet. He postulates, and I think he's on the money, that so this is Mosiah chapter 4, and this is where King Benjamin basically tells his subjects that they, need to, if the petition of the poor, they need to give of their substance to those who are in need. And also in that same chapter in Mosiah chapter 4 is a petition that if you borrow anything, you will be under condemnation if you don't return it.
Right. Right.
And this
which would have definitely directly connected to Martin Harris because of the lost 116 pages, as well as the financial need that Joseph was in during the Harmony period.
Yes, and this correlates really closely with Martin's visit to Harmony, Pennsylvania in March of 1829. This is before Oliver even gets there. Right. And Joseph and Emma are in destitution. We know this because he says this later, but also because Joseph Knight Sr. documents this, because the Hales have stopped supporting the Smiths, because Joseph spent the last summer, instead of planting crops and making sure he had food for the winter, he spent it with Martin Harris doing the lost manuscript. And the Hales are looking on this going, we gave you basically a property and a job, and you squandered that opportunity. And of course you're starving. I don't know, they probably were feeding Emma on the side, but they just were not very happy about Joseph. And Joseph in his 1832 history says that the Hales were about to turn him out. So that's one of the reasons why Oliver is really important, because he comes from Palmyra through to Harmony, Pennsylvania in early April of 1829, and he's got money left over from his teaching, his school teaching, and that money is furnished for the down payment on the mortgage that Joseph organizes with his father-in-law to have some independence and not be reliant on him. Anyway, so those are those interesting interconnections between the text of the Book of Mormon and events that are happening in Joseph's immediate environment.
Yeah, so here's another one you've built for us, the idea of authority. And we kind of talked about this earlier, but one of the things that's very interesting to me about Joseph, whether it's with Hiram Page or sometimes with Oliver Cowdery or other Book of Mormon witnesses, right? One thing that was very clear is if you made a special claim to authority that was above and beyond Joseph Smith's authority, that would not fly, right? And so is this another similar example?
Yeah, this is the first. Well, and this goes back to that folk magic understanding, right? We know from Doctrine and Covenants 8 and 9 that Oliver Cowdery, in the earliest wordings that Joseph changes later, that Oliver Cowdery works with the rod. He also believes in this folk magic, that he's from the same tradition. He's from New England. He's a New England refugee in Western New York, just like the Smiths. But he works with a rod. Mm-hmm. He's got a divining rod, and this is how he gets his revelation. And Oliver believes that they're equal, that Joseph and Oliver are equal, and that he's got a similar gift. It's not exactly the same, but it's a similar gift, and he can translate too. And Doctrine and Covenants 8 suggests that he should be able to translate, except that he can't because this is Joseph's project, right? And so Doctrine and Covenants section 9 demotes him to a scribe and suggests, and this is also mirrored in the text of Mosiah chapter 8, which is done in April of 1829, the idea that a seer is greater than a prophet. The fact that he's got these seer stones make, these are things that have been passed down for, millennia, and these are the ways in which prophets are able to see things that are not seeable by the natural eye and can translate ancient text. And this is embedded in the Book of Mormon at the time that Joseph needs to assert his authority, suggests that he's got gift because he's got a seer stone as opposed to as a divining rod, and Oliver has to be content with being a scribe at this particular point because that's what the Lord wants. So it's an interesting comparison where the Doctrine and Covenants revelations marry with the same understandings in the Book of Mormon at the same time. Doctrine and Covenants section 5 with Martin Harris and the idea of giving to the poor, and then also this understanding with who's going to be in charge in terms of getting the text of the Book of Mormon.
Right. Yeah, that is so interesting to me. It's like I'm still digesting all of the material here.
It's interesting to think of the Book of Mormon. It's just interesting to think of the Book of Mormon as a dynamic text. That it's actually happening in the moment with the environment and the household participant. Like it's not divorced from. That's what suggests to me that it's not ancient or historical, right? Because it's happening in real time. I mean, I believe Joseph has got some storylines and outlines, but the actual text of the Book of Mormon is being influenced by the people that are around. And to them, it feels miraculous, right? You could imagine if you're in the room and you're the scribe, let's say you're Oliver Cowdery, and the text of the Book of Mormon is now saying that baptism is important, and you've always believed that baptism is important. You go like, yes, God, I've got this right. Like it feels miraculous. Right. It validates your position. And you feel like God is speaking to you. It's absolutely that way. And the same thing is happening in Fayette when the anti-Catholic material is validating the Whitmers, the German reformists, the Protestants. They've come out of Germany, which has had these huge Protestant Catholic battles of the 16th and 17th century. These are the reasons why their ancestors came to America, was to flee this persecution of the Catholic Church, and now the Catholic Church is being called out by God in the Book of Mormon. Like, you feel so validated. This is why it's so special to them. That's why they're so excited, and they feel like this text is speaking to them. Like it's a patriarchal blessing, right? When the text speaks to you and calls you out in your ideas, it's valid.
Well, and the text specifically even builds a framework for doing this, right? I think about, and granted, it's not until Nephi, but the idea of likening Scripture unto ourselves, right? That's the purpose of Scripture. So I can see where, because I guess then in my mind, just kind of thinking about your ideas here, is I'm grappling with what this means for Joseph Smith's intentions in creating the Book of Mormon, because there will be some people who will say, well, if Joseph Smith is responding to his contemporary needs and he's responding to the Whitmers' desire to basically be told, what they want to hear, there would be some people who would see that and see it as strong evidence that Joseph Smith basically is a con man and a fraud. Help me understand where you land on that particular question. I'm a big fan of Dan's pious fraud theory, and I think you probably could still square this with some of these parallels that you've found in the text. But help me understand how you view that question, the question of Joseph
Yeah, no,
Smith's motivation and intentions.
um, Joseph Smith, and I talk about it in the book a bit actually, has a number of intentions, like we all do. We're never doing one thing.
Sure.
We're never doing something for only one reason. We're doing it for a multitude of reasons. And in fact, it's really good if we can accomplish a few things at the same time. I think the text suggests that, well, there's a couple of things going on. One, I think that originally the Book of Mormon, or we don't even know what it was called, the project, was really a Christian adventure story, something like Pilgrim's Progress, which was selling incredibly well in Joseph's day. The idea of being an allegory of Christian belief and understanding. I think that's where it started out with in terms of the Book of Mormon. But the loss of the manuscript changed that, because for two reasons. One is that what was produced with Martin Harris, Joseph had a dark night of the soul. Like I said, he spent the whole summer doing this Book of Mormon, or doing this project, and he's got nothing to show for it. And that's just crazy.
Is that where this slide comes in? We've got Book of Lehi, we've got the lost 116 pages. Then we see this pivot that we've been talking about, and the replacement text, obviously, that loops back around from First Nephi to Words of Mormon. Okay.
That's right. I think the lost 116 pages, if we had it, there's some good indications of what it is, right? The replacement text tells us that it's more secular. It's more kind of a story about kings and their trials. I think if you looked at Ether, the Book of Ether, I think that's a good indication of what the lost manuscript would look like. A whole lot of kings and their various concerns and battles, as they work through a Christian environment. That's what I would think. And a good indication of that is Doctrine and Covenants section 19, because when Joseph has to convince Martin to put his money up to publish the Book of Mormon, one of the things that he suggests is that understanding of, well, it's not God's eternal punishment. Eternal is a name for God, right? So that, because I think that when Martin gets to see the new manuscript that he's produced, that Joseph has produced with Oliver, he balks at the ideas, because it talks about eternal punishment, and Martin is a universalist who doesn't believe in eternal punishment. So Joseph has got to convince him that actually it's not really eternal punishment, it's God's punishment, and God is just using those words to motivate people, because if they didn't have something kind of hanging over their head, they wouldn't convert. And this suggests that the lost 116 pages wasn't about this at all, because otherwise Martin would have been expecting this. The lost 116 pages didn't have the idea of eternal damnation or eternal torment or anything like that, because it wasn't about that. It was about this Christian adventure story. It became more embedded in theology with Oliver in harmony, and then even more so as they got to Fayette and had to replace the text because of probably the Whitmers' even greater involvement in religiosity and potentially things like the Book of Isaiah. Moroni in Mormon chapter 8 and 9 says, search the words of Isaiah. I don't have time to write them all down. But suddenly there's huge passages of them in the replacement text. And that is because Isaiah was probably really important to the Whitmers, and they saw in the pages or the text of Isaiah an understanding that the Book of Mormon might come forward. And so those are the kinds of, you don't see the idea of crying from the dust, which is an Isaiah passage that we use to talk about the Book of Mormon. That doesn't come up until Mormon in the Book of Mormon, and then you see it in Mormon, you see it in Ether, you see it in Moroni, you see it in First and Second Nephi. These are understandings that only happen once there is a feeling that this is more religious. So that
I'm trying to think of that specific phrase about search the words of Isaiah. Isn't that in Third Nephi? Isn't that attributed to Christ? Okay.
Christ says
and then
that,
it continues on.
And then Moroni says that as well again in Mormon chapter 8 or 9.
So I feel like maybe my follow-up questions, I didn't give you a good chance to answer my question about Joseph's motivations. I agree with you that, in fact, at work, I manage a lot of different projects, and I often tell people I'm not trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Sometimes I'm trying to knock out 4 or 5 different birds with 1 stone. But I guess at a snapshot, high level, what would you say about Joseph Smith's intention? Do you see him as well-intentioned in creating the Book of Mormon when there are so many of these parallels with him, seeming to cure his contemporary needs in the way you have kind of put this material together and the way you look at the Book of Mormon?
So I think he's a believer. Like, he believes in Jesus. He's had his dark night of the soul after he's lost the lost manuscript. He's had to really, reconcile himself with God, and so he's had a spiritual experience that makes him believe that that he's fallen and he needs Jesus to not be fallen. And he feels like this text will help other people. That King Benjamin verse that we talked about helping the poor and things like that, that if people read these words, they will act better, they will act like Christians, they will do the things that Christians do. And so he's justifying the text because it's going to make people better. That's one of the biggest, again, second person narrative justifications of Moroni and even Nephi, is that you can tell that this is good because it helps you to persuades you to believe in Christ. Right. You can know that anything that is good comes from Christ. This is a justification. I could talk to you about Christ and let me and justify this. So it's not an either or, it's a yes and. He's trying to Joseph is trying to solve his immediate financial issues and his family's eviction. They are effectively homeless. His parents are homeless. So he's trying to solve this. He's also, he also believes he's in this fallen world where people are not treating each other with kindness and they're not sharing of their substance. And this is a great way to put that voice in ancient prophets' mouths and effectively make that happen. He's providing faith, and the fact that the Whitmers and Oliver are really believing in this convinces them that this is a good work, because they're feeling great. They're feeling the Spirit. They're feeling, convicted by this, even though he knows that it's a made-up story or an allegory or some kind of parable. However he's justifying it, the effects are good, therefore they must be of Christ. This is the ends justify the means.
That totally makes sense, not just in light of Doctrine and Covenants 19. So you already talked about Doctrine and Covenants 19, but my position on Doctrine and Covenants 19 is I think it's a very problematic bit of theology that I'm actually surprised I didn't recognize until I left the church, that it literally says that God lies to people for their own good. That I think he uses the phrase like, I selected more express language to work upon the hearts of the children of men. That's like me threatening my kids with some severe punishment that I have absolutely no intention of carrying through, but doing it seriously so that they obey me. At least that's my position on Doctrine and Covenants 19. So I can see where, and I think Dan has this theory as well, that Doctrine and Covenants 19 is basically Joseph building a theological justification for, maybe if lying is too strong a word, telling untruths for people's own benefit, for people's own good, because that is the theory in Doctrine and Covenants 19. Then when you combine that with the idea in the later verses in Moroni, or maybe it's in Mormon, I can't remember, but you talked about how the Book of Mormon actually, I would say, equivocates on the definition of truth by saying whatsoever thing is true is that those things which lead people to do good. So I think you can see support for what you're telling me in the Book of Mormon's text itself, basically, that Joseph Smith could be both well-intentioned, really believe that he's bringing people to Christ, that he really is bringing people into part of his religious experience that he views as legitimate, while also meeting his contemporary needs.
Yes, absolutely. I think you said it so brilliantly. And look, that's exactly how things are now too, right? We've talked about the Book of Mormon as an artifact. If you go and ask people, look, if it's historical or ancient, if it's not historical or ancient, is that going to change your worldview? And they'll probably say, but the church, but the Book of Mormon talks about Christ so much. So I know it, I don't even think about whether it's historical or ancient. I think about the fact that it talks about Jesus, and that is good. So more Jesus is good. What's the problem?
Right. Let me ask you a question about a specific passage that I remember the first time it really connected with me, really troubled me as a believer. So we've talked about how we can find Joseph Smith in the text through looking at the dictation order and his contemporary needs. There's one passage in 2 Nephi 3 where Joseph Smith literally writes himself into the text, right? He writes a prophecy supposedly attributed to Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, the Joseph with the Technicolor Dreamcoat, if you're a fan of Broadway, and the Osmonds, right? Where he literally writes himself into the text of the Book of Mormon. What, if anything, can you tell me about Joseph Smith's contemporary needs at that part of the dictation order? Why? Because to me now, today, it's so obvious that that's a product of Joseph Smith, because prophecy is never that specific. It literally says that he shall be called Joseph after his father, which is also called Joseph. What can you tell me about that specific passage?
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? And because up until this point in the dictation sequence in the Mosiah, Joseph really has let the authors of the Book of Mormon, or at least the prophets of the Book of Mormon, be the prophets of the Book of Mormon. It's not until in this passage in 2 Nephi chapter 3 where he puts in the mouth of one of these prophets that Joseph is the special one. And this has actually happened already, kind of, in the sense that in Mormon chapter 8 and 9, where Moroni is doing that justification about how the record is going to be received. And this also happens in 3 Nephi slightly, where it says basically, he who brings this forth is special, or, is my messenger, or is, it's going to have a hard time, but I'm going to protect him. Those kinds of ideas come up in those passages. But it's not until 2 Nephi chapter 3 that it specifies Joseph as that person, as somebody that is foretold. And I think that this has a lot to do with two things that's probably going on at the same time. One is the Whitmers feel very special about this text, and they feel very special about Joseph. So Joseph's view of himself is elevated a little bit. And maybe he feels like he's in a position where he can kind of assert the idea, I am a prophet, I am something special. And so that goes into the text. But also there's a couple of things that happen prior to 2 Nephi chapter 3, which are really interesting to me in the text. And you see it when earlier in 1 Nephi, when you see Lehi's dream. So Nephi recounts Lehi's dream, and then Nephi has a similar experience, right, where he experiences the dream and is able to interpret the dream. So that puts Nephi kind of above Lehi, even kind of like surpassing your father kind of a scenario, which I think is also happening with Joseph personally. He is, his father has been the visionary of the family. Now Joseph is the visionary of the family, just like Nephi is surpassing his father Lehi. But there's also a really curious part where after Nephi has expounded upon Lehi's dream and given interpretation, that the brothers are like, we don't understand this, and this seems like weird, and why, there's a few discrepancies between what you've told us about Lehi's dream and what Nephi's thing is. And there's a whole kind of little justification there where Nephi has to kind of pointedly say to his brothers, you of little faith, if you had faith, you'd be able to understand this. And Lehi didn't mention the water of filthy, the filthy water between the great and spacious building and the tree of life, because he was too distracted by other things. But I saw it, and you need to listen to me, basically. Right. And so I think that part of 2 Nephi chapter 3 is Joseph asserting his dominance in this space, maybe on the back of a little bit of criticism from maybe the Whitmer household as a whole, maybe the Whitmer brothers, who are going, hang on a second, does this make any sense? And and then this assertion in 2 Nephi chapter 3, elevates Joseph to being the voice, just like we talked about with potentially Oliver Cowdery in Mosiah chapter 8, where a seer is greater than a prophet, and right. a seer stone is the way that you're going to interpret languages, not a divining rod. So it's kind of like a way to go, hang on a second, oh look, the text says that I'm the special one. Right.
What do you know?
What do you know? What I think is really fascinating about this too, this is just an aside, but it's fun, is that Joseph also writes this passage in 2 Nephi chapter 3 into his Joseph Smith translation of Genesis chapter 50.
Right.
So he puts it in there, but there are some wording changes. So one of the text, the original text of Doctrine and Covenants section 5, says basically, the Book of Mormon is going to be Joseph's only project.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1835, that's not the case, right? So Joseph changes the revelation in Doctrine, which is now Doctrine and Covenants section 5, the one to Martin, and basically says, this is the first work that I'm going to get you to do. And then there'll be others. Basically, that's the text change from the original revelation in March of 1829 and what happens in 1835. And this is the same in this. And the text change between 2 Nephi chapter 3 basically says, I'm only going to give him this work. But of course, that doesn't happen. Joseph goes on to produce the Book of Mormon, head the church, and do all these other things. So the text in the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis chapter 50, which includes this passage from 2 Nephi chapter 3, basically says, this is the effectively the same kind of change. This is the first work, and I'm going to do other work with them.
That's really interesting.
Really fascinating, isn't it? Just so much that's you can go, which is why I get so excited about it. Obviously, very animated as I tell you this.
For sure. I don't know we've had a whole lot of disagreement between us, Ganesh, but one thing I know for sure is we have had a super interesting conversation about Book of Mormon authorship. Do you have any closing thoughts or any resources aside from your book we've talked about that you want to point people to if they're interested in learning more about your work?
So I'm doing a presentation at Sunstone, and a lot in companionship to you, Colby, basically looking at some of the text of the Book of Mormon and how the repeated stories, basically, that Joseph is using kind of cut and paste technique to reuse particular stories multiple times in order to give him volume in the text, and some of those are just so fascinating. And I guess if we're talking about Book of Mormon authorship, to me there are levels, right? There is the textual level, the one that you read and that you listen to, and that's devotional, that sits on the top, and that's the level at which most people engage with the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And then there's another level down that is, what are the textual structures that are happening in the Book of Mormon, and what does that tell us about the ways in which Joseph is composing the text and embedding his ideas in the stories that are going on. That's another layer. Another layer again that we've talked about a lot today, which is what's the real-time production of the Book of Mormon? How are the events in the household impacting the text of the Book of Mormon because of these synergies that are happening from, either the household where he is in Harmony, or the household in the Whitmer farm where he is in Fayette? How are they affecting the text because of Joseph's real-time need in a particular moment? What's happening there? And then also maybe another layer down, which we've kind of touched on today, but which is really embedded, and which I love John Lunwell's work for, is the kind of what is the culture that is permeating Joseph's understandings that is then undermining the text. And one of those cultures is that biblical culture, that Christian conversion that he's had. Those are the things that we've talked a little bit about today.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the one that's really important, and one that John Lunwell's talking a lot about, is that embedded culture of folk magic. How is magic and really informing Joseph's core identity, and how is that embedding in the text of the Book of Mormon, maybe even part of the composition process? Those things are really fascinating to me, and I think that there's still lots of work to be done on that. So yes, so much good stuff to be involved in. But I love what you're doing, Colby. I'll be excited about your presentation at Sunstone. I think that understanding Joseph, what is going on for him in a real practical sense in the moment, is a really key one. He is incredibly attuned to his environment. He is reacting in real time to what's going on and the people around him. That's one of his great strengths, his great talents. And I think it goes right back to the very beginning when talking about the book and the pivots. That's why we see these changes, and pivots in Joseph's life, because when he encounters a roadblock, when there's something that happens that doesn't align with the thing that he thought would happen, he is really good at being dynamic and changing in the moment, and making that so exciting to the people around him that they go with him, rather than balk against the fact that it didn't work out, or that maybe it's even contradictory. He's so good with people that he takes them along with his pivots, and they feel like it's their privilege, not just that he's changing the rules and undermining everything that they stood for just a few minutes ago. Yeah, so.
It is one of the great ironies to me of the current LDS church leaders inheriting the system that began with Joseph Smith. Is whatever one thinks about Joseph Smith, he had no compunction about completely pivoting and changing his theology, his scriptures, right? He's making edits to Revelations. And yet the church today is so ossified and so stuffy, and just has so many inclinations the exact opposite direction of Joseph Smith's willingness to pivot. Again, whatever one thinks about his motivations in doing those pivots, it's uncontestable that he did them all throughout his life, and that his views changed and evolved over time, I think to his benefit. That it's one of the things that allowed his movement to grow at the rate that it did, to become the movement that it eventually became. Now, I would say many movements, right? And it's just so interesting to me that the inheritors of Joseph Smith, like the people who sit in Joseph Smith's seat today, seem to have the exact opposite inclinations as Joseph Smith did, as far as his willingness to be dynamic, to adapt, to maintain the church through its charisma, or through his charisma, I mean, is something that's very interesting about Joseph Smith. Ganesh, thank you so much for being on this episode of Let's Disagree with Me. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I need to make sure and do, because I often get into the mode where I'm so excited about what a guest is presenting that I never allow them to ask me any questions. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask me? Or maybe if you have a series, we'll wait for a follow-up interview. But if you had any, based on something I've said that has caused you to raise an eyebrow, or if you thought, oh, that's interesting, I wanted to leave room for that as we conclude today.
I guess the only thing that, there are lots of things I really enjoy about the ways that you work, Colby, that that I've expressed already. And one other one is that obviously you're passionate about this, and you're young. Not that I'm old, but I think we're probably 15 years apart, right? So I'm kind of in the tail end, and you're just at the beginning of this moment where actually you get to share. Do you have a thought of where this will go, or maybe even why? What is it that compels you to start a podcast, to want to engage in these discussions? How has it changed your perspective? Or there's multiple questions. And how does this work with your family and your work? Because obviously this may not pay a great deal, and yet you're obviously spending a ton of time and energy in it. I'm at the tail end where I've had a career and I've got some backing behind me, so I can spend the time. But I look at you and go, gosh, you're spending a lot of time, and it can't be financially useful right at this particular point. So, yeah.
No, great questions. And actually, yes, it does use a lot of time. But the truth is, I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't enjoy it. So for years, really in 2022 is when I first started, basically, I would say tripping backwards into accidentally becoming a podcaster, is the way I've joked about it before. And I truly would not do it, and I wouldn't continue doing it if it wasn't fun and interesting for me. One of the things that has lined up just really well is when I started kind of, guest appearing on Mormon Stories or with Radio Free Mormon, that my best friend that grew up here in Boise near me, he moved down to Utah. And I just didn't have a whole lot of in-person community time anymore, just based on the fact that he had moved away. And so the reality is, with a young family, my youngest is 7, with a demanding job, with other projects, like last semester, I was even teaching as a part-time legal writing professor. Between work, family, and podcast stuff, that is literally all that I do at this point. And I guess to answer your question, I'm definitely not doing it for financial benefit. So I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't find it fun and interesting. But the thing I value about it is the opportunity to have conversations like this and to test my own ideas, my own understanding, to learn from other people is something that I'm always looking forward to. And the other piece I guess I should say is my wife and I have a fantastic relationship based on these same types of conversations. Like any podcast interview I'm going to do, I promise folks, even though she's not a big fan of being on podcasts anymore, my wife is like a silent partner in all of these things. The ideas that I'm sharing are often as a result of our conversations going into a conversation, me sharing with her an outline or someone else's slides or my own slides and discussing those things with her. So I guess my answer to your question is I'm doing it because I enjoy it. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about my perspective as someone who views themselves as both an agnostic atheist and an optimistic nihilist is I don't believe there's some grand purpose to the universe. That doesn't mean that it's not meaningful to me, or that my time, the way I spend my time, isn't meaningful and valuable to me. So I actually think that means so much more for the way that I spend my time. And aside from, like I said, having the opportunity to have these conversations and have this small channel, the rest of my time is spent with my kids, because that is the only way that I feel personally fulfilled and like I'm fulfilling my responsibility and duty to them. As far as where this channel is going to go, I truthfully have absolutely no idea. There was a little bit of me when I started it just a few months ago. I thought, not that it's like wildly successful, but I kind of thought like, I won't be too heartbroken if this just kind of spins out and doesn't go anywhere, because trying to like build a space for respectful disagreement on the internet is not exactly the best like way to get recognized by the algorithm. But I'm really happy with the way the channel has gone so far. I'm really grateful for all the guests that I've been able to host. I think the biggest thing to me is that the channel needs to continue to be sustainable for myself and my family, and it needs to be fun. If it ceases being fun, then I'm going to find a way to fill my time with things that fill my cup up rather than don't fill my cup up, that expend some of my energy. I guess the last thing I'll say is the other reason that I was so resistant to starting a channel is I was very wary of what people call audience capture. So the last thing I want to be is anyone's hero, is anyone's mentor. So I appreciate when people say kind words about me, because that's one of my love languages, but it also makes me deeply, deeply uncomfortable. I've tolerated it with you, Ganesh, because of that charming, charming accent. But no, I guess that's the best I can do to answer your question. Is I love the little community that's been built around this channel. I love seeing like recurring commenters. I love having the opportunity to have guests like you that have such interesting ideas and have such a wide variety of opinions. And I hope it continues. I hope it continues to grow, because I really feel like, I mean, I have shared this in other places, with the political turmoil and the civil unrest that we've seen in the United States continue to grow over the last several years. I felt like I wanted to do everything I could to try and swing the pendulum back the other direction, to try and help people see value in each other, even when we disagree, to see that our commonalities are a lot more important than the small differences we often have between each other, to help build empathy, to help see each other's perspectives. And that, if this channel continues to have a longer future, to have a longer tail, it will be because that mission is what is most important to me, is being effective at helping people see each other's humanity.
Brilliant. Well, that is amazing and wonderful, and totally aligns with all of the same kinds of feelings I have on the same subjects, which is really nice. And it's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, me too. And we're going to do it again. I promise you that. Folks, we will have Ganesh back for another interesting conversation, if not disagreement, in the future. Ganesh, thank you for being my guest today. Please check out Ganesh's book, his biography on Joseph Smith. Do you want to show it one more time for me, Ganesh? Perfect. Joseph Smith, an architect of Mormonism, a topical biography. I promise that it's got a lot of really good resources. If you enjoyed today's episode, it will be right up your alley. Thanks again, Ganesh. And folks, please like and subscribe and stay tuned here for more interesting conversations in the future.